Grand Canal is about a mile in that direction. So it was a fairly compact, dense city at that stage. There were small suburbs to the south in Rathmines, Rathgar, Palmerston, and then further out in Dunleary, what was then Kingston. There were suburbs in the far northeast in Hope and Sutton, and then there were suburbs up the river. But the main population was in this area here. So not quite. So we're going to walk up, make a slight dog-legged detour up here to the first building, which I think is really the beginning of 1960. Howdah was basically anchored, or where the Matt Talbot Bridge, this concrete bridge here, was built in the 70s. Yeah. So the navigation went right up the bridge in 1915. So the Ord would have been anchored more or less where that bridge is. Onto that point, exactly, the Memorial Bridge. I mean, the Windjammer, this is the only remaining hint to the port that was here. The Windjammer is a sailor slang for a square-rigged ship. So the Windjammers in the 18th and 19th, and even into the 20th century, would have been along the quays here. So this is the only remaining hint of what was here. Now, they used to have a lovely painted pub sign of a Windjammer. It was a gorgeous painting. And I've been on to the owner to find out what happened to the swinging sign. And he doesn't know. He's searching for it. I have a feeling it's somewhere up on the roof somewhere, and I've asked him to go hunting for it because I want him to put it back up there. So be careful crossing the road. Beginning of 1916, 10 years after the famine in 1857, I think. 1857. 1858, 10 years after. The IRB were founded in a Georgian building that was here. Obviously, this whole block was Georgian. It's all gone. But the IRB were founded here. But the IRB anyway were founded here, and they were the secret group within the volunteers who actually drove the whole rising. I mean, they were a secret group, and after the failures of 1798 and their uprising in 10 years later in 1868, the Fenian uprising, where the British secret police, the organisation was riddled with spies. So they vowed that later on they would form a cabal within any organisation they were going to work with to make sure their plans were not divulged to the British secret police. So
was this a private house that it was founded
at the time? I'm not quite sure what it was. I think it was a lodging house at the time. The research, the only research I can do, suggests there were people living here. But as I say, this whole area would have been a warren of Georgian tenements in good and bad condition. Some of the streets were prosperous, some of them weren't. In among factories, small factories, in all of these streets here. So there was a very densely populated area. So as far as I can find out, it was some type of a lodging house. So you could say really that 1916 begins here with the founding of the IRB.
In what year?
That was 1858. So it's exactly 10 years after the worst year of the famine. And it's 9 years later they had their Fenian uprising, which fell apart really because their plans, the special branch knew exactly what they were up to. People like O'Donovan Rossa and Clark, who surfaces later in O'Connell Street, I mean, they were involved in the foundation of this organisation. So normally I start this walk here because it's the logical place, I think, to start. But I met you down here because you were coming from the Lewis, right? So we're going to make a dog leg back to the river, okay, Britton Street, which is now Parnell Street. And the officer there said a message for General Lowe to arrive, and he refused to take surrender from a fellow. He said he wasn't prepared to take surrender from a woman, and she had to go back and get Pierce and come back with Pierce. And that's where this famous photograph comes from. I mean, there was a conspiracy theory that she was cut out of the photograph, but in fact she's not. It was just the angle the photograph was taken at. She's behind Pearse.
You can see her feet.
That's right. So she was sent back to get Pearse, and she brought Pearse back up to the barricade, and apparently then Lowe instructed Pearse to go back, and he wanted a written unconditional surrender, so Pearse had to go back and write that and then bring it back to the barricade. So O'Farrell lived in a Georgian house that was just along the quay here, and she was obviously in the Red Cross, and she was sort of vanishes from most accounts of the rise. But then I think that's true of a lot of the women.
Of Pearse and Connolly on a stretcher in the GPO.
Yes, the famous painting.
The famous painting, yes, seems to be the only, what would you call it, the only record, even if it's a bogus one.
Well, I mean, you have to remember they were absolutely being bombarded. I mean, there were no infantry engagement. It was all machine gun and artillery.
Yeah.
So they just didn't have a chance to organise anything.
Yes, but this was something they should have thought about.
Yes, but yeah.
Obviously, they were not so media savvy.
Well, funnily enough, I mean, we'll get to that when we talk about Rosie Hackett. Connolly had become very media savvy because he'd spent time in America working with the Wobblies. And
Unions, yes.
The miners in America, and he was conscious of the fact that you had to try and communicate, and that the media, mainly in the main, were opposed and against left-wing ideals. So you had to try and control some means of producing communication. So they had a printing press. One of the first things Connolly organised, in fact, was a printing press in Liberty Hall.
For the proclamation?
Well, no, to distribute information about the union activity. I'm talking about in the years leading up to 1916.
Okay.
I mean, I'm going to jump back 3 years now to the lockout. When we get to the next this church, a dock worker. So, I mean, during the period we're talking about, from I don't know the 1890s up to the 1880s up to 1916. The working and living conditions in Dublin were appalling. Just a couple of statistics. The infant mortality rate in Dublin was higher than Calcutta in India. And the slum and sanitary conditions in Dublin were actually worse than Naples in Sicily. So the living and working conditions were absolutely appalling. And this was at a time when the whole Celtic revival was happening. But the two things seem to have been totally unconnected. The people involved in the nationalist revival didn't seem to see what was going on within the city. So the reaction, I suppose, was the formation of trade unionism for general workers. Craftsmen and tradesmen always were allowed to have trade unions, but the general worker was not. And the employers in Dublin would simply have no truck with the general workers' trade union. So James Connolly and Larkin founded the Irish Transport and General Workers Union to cater for the lumpen proletariat, these people. And their headquarters were based, obviously, in Liberty Hall. And if you like, the first uprising, and to my mind the most important uprising, was 1913, not 1916. That's the perspective I would approach this in. Because what Connolly and Larkin were talking about were living conditions, sanitation, housing, education. And they had organised general strikes in Belfast, Liverpool and Glasgow in the 1909s and 1911s. In fact, Connolly organised the Protestant working class in Belfast to strike with the Catholic working class in Belfast against the employers. Again, for a general trade union. And that was the first time, in fact, that Catholic and Protestant workers had worked together for a common cause. Now, the unionist tradition in Belfast saw the danger there and quickly acted to break that. And there was a lot of unionist propaganda against what Connolly was trying to achieve in Belfast. He'd also worked with the mine workers in America, so he came back here with a firm plan of what needed to happen in the cities, not just in Dublin, but in Liverpool, Manchester, Birmingham, Glasgow. They all had the same appalling living conditions. So if you like, the first uprising was in September 1913 with the lockout. And the Dublin employers basically went to war with the general workers. Now, the Dublin employers mainly were Irish employers. There was a very small number of unionist employers, but the majority of the Federated Union of Employers in Dublin, what was your official title? The Irish Federation of Employers. I can't remember their title, but they were in the main Irishmen. Some of them would have been old Anglo-Irish, some of them would have been unionists, but most of them were home rulers. They supported home rule. But nonetheless, they were quite prepared to go and starve their fellow Irishmen. So in this surrounding area here, there was a horrendous civil war, the first civil war really, it was a class war between the employers and the working class. And it went on from September 1913. I think the workers they were starved out basically by February, March 1914. And it was sent, has anyone read the novel Strumpet City? Okay, well Strumpet City, the parish church it's based on is this parish church here. And the parish house is the red brick building there. Kelly based it on this little parish here. I don't know if you remember the scene where the priest staggers across the bridge in Strumpet City from the riot in Berefoot's place behind the custom house. He staggers across Butt Bridge into the parish house here. So Strumpet City was set in this area here. And the politics of it leads into 1916 in the sense that the government in Westminster was totally transfixed on what was happening in Dublin. They were afraid that Connolly and Larkin were going to link up with unions in Liverpool and Manchester and Glasgow and Belfast and form a general strike. And they saw something like what happened later in Russia. They saw a general uprising across the United Kingdom. And they were so transfixed with what was happening here that they kept their eye off the ball in the north, and the Unionists, the Ulster Volunteers, were able to get the weapons in January 1914. They were the British government of Westminster thought that the real problem was going to be the social upheaval here, and not the pending problem they were having with the unions in the north of Ireland. So, we'll go on to Liberty Hall.
Where was Connolly from?
Connolly was born in Glasgow.
Was he?
Yeah, of Irish parents. Larkin was born in Liverpool of Irish parents. So, if you like, they were bringing back to Dublin their experiences in Britain. The other thing we should talk about at this stage is the third Home Rule Bill came in 1912. It was brought in March 1912. Was it March or May? Something like that. And that had a reaction in the north, the formation of the Ulster Volunteers, who were going to oppose Home Rule. Now, they estimated that the bill was going to be through the Houses of Parliament in Westminster by 1914. So the two things were the ball was beginning to roll. You had the Home Rule Bill being introduced in 1912, and then you had this uprising here, and the reaction of the Dublin Castle and the Dublin establishment to the strike was quite brutal. And Connolly resolved that the next strike that they would call that they would have their own army to defend them. So in the middle of this strike, they founded the Irish Citizen Army, which was the first revolutionary army to be formed in that period. Although I suppose you could say the Ulster Volunteers were revolutionary as well. They were formed in January 1913 in reaction to the introduction of the Home Rule Bill. So you had the organisation of the Ulster Volunteers, and then you had the organisation of the Irish Citizen Army to defend workers against the Dublin police. So will we go on to Liberty Hall?
It's incredible the timing of them, the First World War.
Well, all the events cascaded one on top of the other.
That would have been a draw and a distraction. Draw on all the proletariat, the army, that kind of thing.
Well, you see, unfortunately, that's what happened. If you like the workers, the transport union was defeated in 1914. They had to go back to work with the conditions that the employers wanted. But really, the employers won the war, but they won the battle, but they lost the war because union membership shot them thereafter. But unfortunately, then the war came along, and all these unemployed people simply joined the British Army. So Larkin and Connolly had been working together for 10 years. In 1911, they bought an old hotel which was on the corner here, and they turned that into the headquarters of the Irish Transport and General Workers Union. And from there, they organised the lockout in 1913. And the fight between the workers and the employers became so bitter. Right being a trade union, and it's still a problem now. It's still a huge. We've gone backwards actually. But the strike was about the right to be in the union. It wasn't about more pay. It was simply the right to be a member of the union, and the employers were not prepared to have it. So after 3 or 4 months of this, they decided they had to arm themselves. Now, obviously, the Dublin Castle knew this was happening, and they were sending the messages to Westminster, and Westminster was saying, you have to stop this. And that's how I think they missed what was happening in Ulster. Because in Ulster, the Ulster Volunteers were getting ready to resist Home Rule. Meanwhile, the bill is passing through Westminster. So it's all happening at the same time.
So they got away with bringing in loads of arms and everything.
Oh yes. The Ulster Volunteers in Larne.
But the British knew they were bringing in
absolutely.
arms.
And they were the first to parley with the Germans. The Ulster Volunteers were the first to do a deal with the Germans. 90,000 rifles and something like 500,000 rounds of ammunition they were on. The Volunteers of Hope, I think they landed a couple of hundred rifles. And I think, a couple of thousand rounds of ammunition. So, from the beginning, Westminster was looking at Belfast and Dublin completely from a different point of view. So this was the planning centre for 1916. While all this is happening, the IRB are standing back from the lockout. They didn't really get involved because, my opinion is, they were compromised. Because a lot of the IRB supporters in business were the employers who were starving out these workers. Now, most of the employers would have been home rulers. They would have supported Redmond and the bill that was going through Westminster. But a substantial number of them were supporters of Sinn Féin and the IRB. So there was a huge conflict there. And Connolly kept his distance, the bridge just here. The reason the new bridge was called after Rosie Hackett, as well as running the soup kitchens from here, they had a co-op around the corner here on Eden Quay, and Rosie Hackett ran the co-op. The co-op was basically second-hand clothes and shoes and things like that, and food parcels. She ran the co-op for a number of years, and when Connolly set up the print shop, she should be patron saint of printers as well, okay? Because when they set up the print shop behind the co-op, which is basically on the far side of Liberty Hall there, and she became the protector of the print shop because the DMP, the Metropolitan Police, were constantly raiding to smash the print shop. Because to go back to what I was saying earlier, that was their only means of producing their own information. I mean, the newspapers were totally, obviously, against the strike. So the only way they had of putting their own propaganda out was in the print shop. And it was smashed up twice by the DMP. In the final assault coming up to 1916, Rosie was there with James Connolly, and the detectives arrived again, but this time they had arms, and he pulled out a gun and he threatened them and they left. That was in about 2 weeks before 1916. The foundation of the IRB, Thomas Francis Marr was one of the people who founded the IRB back over where we began. And he was in Paris with a group of colleagues during the revolution in 1848 in Paris. There were revolutions across Europe. It was called the Year of Revolution because there were revolutions in most of the capitals against the various monarchies across Europe. And this group of IRB people were in Paris, and they saw, that was the first time the French tricolour was flown. It was in the 1848 revolution. And they were infatuated with this concept of a symbol that could be used to unite antagonistic forces in one country. So they brought back the notion of the green, white and orange flag for a new society. And they unveiled it in a hall here in 1840. They had just come back from Paris. There were revolutions in Frankfurt, Paris, Prague. It was the spirit of the age. It was a bit like 1968. It was just something in the air. And the uprisings were against monarchy, and the notion of like a republic that would include disparate groups was the spirit of these revolutions. So this group of people, Thomas Francis Marr, and who are the other two people? Doesn't actually name the people. Yes, Thomas Francis Marr is the only one named, but there were a group of them. Yeah. Now Thomas Francis Marr is he's an amazing character. He was in the Rising, the Fenian Rising of 1867. He was in Paris for this revolution. He was jailed after the Fenian Rising, and he was sent to Van Diemen's Land. There were about 7 of them sent to Van Diemen's Land. Now, a group of the Fenians who had escaped to New York got a fund together to hire a skipper and a whaling ship from Massachusetts to sail down the Atlantic, around the Cape, what's the Cape at the bottom of South Horn? Yeah. Yes, Cape Horn. And over to Van Diemen's Land in Australia. They rendezvoused off the beach where the prison was. It was an open prison. And the 6 of them got to the boat and they made it back to New York. It's an incredible story. And he later he fought in the Union Army. He fought in the Union Army, I think, he fought in the Civil War on the Union side. And he ended up as governor of Montana. There's a statue to him.
I've been to Helena, Montana.
Have you?
I've seen the statue.
Oh, you've seen the statue? Okay. Unfortunately, I've never been there.
Yeah.
But he's an amazing character. Do you know the story?
I just bits and pieces
Yeah.
as you're saying.
An absolutely amazing character.
Catalpa.
Sorry?
It's the Catalpa rescue, isn't it?
The which?
The ship, the Catalpa.
Was that the name of the
of
ship?
the ship?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that in itself was an amazing journey.
Oh, extraordinary. Yeah.
Quite amazing. So anyway, they brought the flag back here. Now, I think the first time it was flown in public actually was Waterford. But they unveiled it here at an IRB meeting. So events now are beginning to unfurl really quickly. So you have, in 1912, the Home Rule Bill is introduced. And the politics of that, briefly, the Liberal Party in England were trying to introduce reform into the economic system in the UK, and they were being blocked by the Tories in the House of Lords. They couldn't get the economic bills through. So they made a pact with the Irish Parliamentary Party in 1909, thereabouts, to get their economic reform bill through the House of Commons and through the House of Lords. And the quid pro quo for the Irish Parliamentary Party was that if they helped the Liberals get this economic bill through, that the Liberals would bring in an act to take away the right from the House of Lords to veto the bill. Now this was a major constitutional step. They were taking a major power away from the House of Lords. But the Liberals agreed to do that. So when they introduced the Home Rule Bill in 1912, the House of Lords wouldn't be able to stop the bill. They had successfully stopped the first bill in 1884, 86, and in Parnell's attempt, 92. Was it 92 or 94? Anyway, the House of Lords stopped Home Rule twice in the late 19th century. But the 1912 bill is going to be through. So the Ulster Volunteers were formed in 1913 to resist Home Rule. And then very quickly thereafter, here in November 1913, all of these things are happening at one time. It's an incredible hurdy-burdy. In November 1913, the Irish Volunteers were formed. There was a committee formed here, and they were an answer to the Ulster Volunteers. They were going to ensure that Home Rule was successful. So, you know, the game was being set for some sort of civil war, because you now had two volunteer armies. You had the Ulster Volunteers and the Irish Volunteers. So they were formed in. So within an 8-month period, you had three armed militias formed. You had firstly the Ulster Volunteers in January 1913. Then you had the Irish Citizen Army formed in November 1913. And a couple of weeks later, you had the Irish Volunteers formed. So you had three new armies in Ireland, and they were all buying arms on the continent, mainly from the Germans. Because the Germans, they saw trouble was coming with Britain, and they were quite happy to stir the pot in England, in Britain's backyard. So the Germans were quite happy to sell arms to anyone who was going to cause trouble for Britain. So the Ulster Volunteers were formed here in 1913, and it's important to remember that they were formed not to organise an uprising, but they were formed to support the constitutional government of Westminster in enacting a Home Rule Bill. So they were not a revolutionary organisation. They saw themselves as a constitutional organisation. But from the word go, there was a cabal within the Volunteers, and they were the IRB. And they were the old fiends, and they saw the opportunity to use this organisation to form the basis for an uprising. And they set then to try and form a bridge to Connolly's organisation, the Irish Citizen Army. So the events are really cascading now. You have 1912, 1913, three armed groups in the country, and then the kibosh was put on in March 1914, when the officers commanding the British Army in the Curragh sent a message to Westminster saying that if they were sent north to confront the Ulster Volunteers to help the British government enforce Home Rule, that they would not fire on their northern cousins. So in effect, the British Army mutinied in Ireland, and they said they would not follow instructions from Westminster. That's the incredible politics about Ireland again. The British Army mutinied, and there was nothing done. What happened was that who was the Prime Minister at the time? Asquith furiously then started parleying with the Ulster Volunteers to see if they would take compromise on the Home Rule Act and that would give them a parliament in Belfast. Now Redmond had negotiated one parliament in Dublin, but the British government realised that they were going to have an army that was not prepared to enforce home rule in the north, but they had 3 armed groups who were prepared to fight over it. And one of the armed groups, the Irish Citizen Army, had nearly caused a revolution in the city. So the British government in Westminster were caught in a hot spot, and they were quickly trying to parley with Carson and the Ulster Volunteers. And they pulled a fast one in Redmond, because Redmond had not agreed to a second parliament. But they quickly offered, or were sending out feelers to the Ulster Volunteers to offer them a parliament in Dublin. Now initially it was for it to be a fixed period, and eventually they would come down to the Dublin Parliament. But the Ulster Volunteers knew that if they got a Belfast Parliament, they were never going to be forced out of it. So by 1950, you had the mutiny in the Curragh in March 1914. In July, the Archduke is assassinated in Sarajevo and the balloon goes up in Europe. The bill is passed through the House of Commons and the House of Lords in June 1914. So in fact the bill is passed and it goes to the King and the King signs it. So in effect it came into law, but it was, if you like, postponed for the duration of the European War. So it was never enacted. But you could argue that the terms of the Home Rule Act is basically what we got in the Free State 6 years later.
Yeah.
I mean, effectively, it was the Home Rule Act. They made a few minor changes to it. So you sort of wonder what 1960, the War of Independence, was all about. That's a negative way of looking at it. But the group, obviously, the IRB group within the Volunteers saw their opportunity in August 1914 that this was their chance now to organise an uprising with German support. So in 1915, Casement was sent to Germany to get among the prisoner of war camps in Germany where there were British prisoners, and to try and convince the Irishmen who were in these prisoner of war camps to form a militia with help of the Germans back to fight the British in Ireland. So it was that really, and the arms deals they did, that was the legal pretext for shooting them all. It was not that they organised an uprising, it was that they were parleying with the enemy. It was the defence of the realm act was in fact why legally how the British could shoot them, or in their eyes anyway. So the Irish Volunteers then, the group within the Volunteers, linked up with Connolly, and they organised an uprising to happen in Easter week 1916. Connolly had been converted in the previous year that he had to throw his lot in with the nationalist movement, and particularly when Pearse and Clark had secret meetings with Connolly, and he agreed. Now it was Pearse and Connolly that wrote the proclamation, and you can see in the proclamation Connolly's hand and Pearse's hand. You can see the bits that Connolly wrote, and he was going into it for a socialist republic.
He was the only one who had thought out what was going to happen at the end.
Yes. He said there was no point in changing the bureaucracy and the flag if you were not going to fundamentally change the distribution of wealth in society. Now he went into it for one reason, and there were a whole group of other people who went into it for other reasons, and I would say Pearse was one of them. I mean, to my mind, I don't want to disparage him, but Pearse was a complete nutter.
Well, no revolution is complete without a few of them.
A few nutters. Yeah. Well, Connolly was a nutter as well, but in a different sense.
Yeah.
So, anyway, the uprising was planned between the group within the Volunteers and the IRB group within the Volunteers and Connolly's group. Now, Owen McNeill, I don't quite understand his role. Now, in 1914, the Volunteers split. because Redmond made his speech. Where did he make his speech? Wooden Bridge, was it? In Wicklow. Redmond made his speech where he said the Irish volunteers should go and help Britain defend the rights of small nations, i.e. Belgium, and that in doing so they would be establishing Ireland's right to their own parliament. So most of the Irish volunteers went with Redmond into the British Army. I think there was something like 110,000, was it? Something like that. 110,000 Irish volunteers joined the British Army on Redmond's suggestion, and about 1,100 stayed out. So the volunteers who joined the British Army were called the National Volunteers. In other words, they were volunteering to join the British Army to fight the Germans on the understanding that they would be winning home rule for Ireland. Then there was about 1,100 volunteers said, we're not having any of that. We're going to start organising an uprising. Now, Owen MacNeill stayed with the Irish volunteers as the commandant. So we go on now to the final part of the hunt. They did have a plan, and the plan was the Red are the main British Army bases around the city. The Irish volunteers and the IRB plan was that Casement was going to return to Ireland with a huge amount of arms on the Odd, and at the same time hopefully Irish volunteers. So the plan was that the Odd would land in Kerry with a huge amount of arms, and the ship was filled with arms. The Germans had laden the thing down with arms, and the volunteers in Cork were going to have a large uprising there which would tie down British troops in the south. And the volunteers would take these areas here in the city, and the areas were to counter the British main base. The main bases were where you were today earlier at Collins' Barracks. There were also bases in Rathmines, the Phoenix Park and Beggars Bush. So these areas that the volunteers were to take were to control the city centre. And in itself, I suppose it was a good plan. The plan was then that when the arms arrived in Cork, the British Army would be tied down there, and the volunteers in Dublin would tie down the British Army in the city. And hopefully then the Germans would send an expeditionary force if they could hold out. Now, I'm afraid that was never going to happen. The Germans were never going to send a force. The Royal Navy controlled the seas around the UK, and the Germans were quite happy to send arms and a submarine, but they were not going to send troops. So the volunteers were convincing themselves this was going to happen. It was never going to happen. So anyway, their plan was to take these parts of the cities, and they did. They held them for various amounts of time. We're on O'Connell Street here. We've moved down, the headquarters moved from Liberty Hall into the GPO here. But when the events happened on Easter Monday, the British thought that Liberty Hall was still the headquarters. Now, the big tactical mistake the volunteers made was they didn't take Dublin Castle. Strategically in the city, had he taken Dublin Castle, they would have prevented troops. The troops from Collins' Barracks were able to come down this route into Trinity College. Now, that was, they were able to move artillery into the city, and it was the artillery. The British decided they were not going to fight the volunteers with troops. You know, there were no engagements between the troops and the volunteers. It was all done with artillery. The other mistake the volunteers made was in not taking Trinity College. There was a cadet training volunteer group in Trinity College, and they closed all the gates immediately. It was a bit like Londonderry. They sealed Trinity College, and they allowed the British Army through this route to bring artillery into the green in Trinity College. They also had artillery opposite Liberty Hall here. So their big mistake was in not taking this axis here. From Liberty Hall, an Irish Citizen Army group went up to take Dublin Castle, but they didn't succeed. There were armed police there, and they locked the gates and they couldn't get into the castle. And the volunteers had no real means of knocking down structures, so they weren't able to get into the castle. So really it was this axis which was left open to the British Army. So on Easter Monday then, the volunteers went off to the various stations around the city, and the main group came down Abbey Street to the GPO, carrying all their ammunition and weapons in handcarts. And they took over buildings here. The Metropole Hotel was here. They took this building, all the corner buildings on O'Connell Street. And the other big mistake they made was in not taking the building on the far side of O'Connell Bridge. The British quickly established a machine gun base up there, and they were able to control the street from that building. But the volunteers had control of most of these buildings here. The Imperial Hotel was on the far side of Cleary's, and they took that as well. Now, Connolly delighted in taking that building because the Imperial Hotel was owned by Martin Murphy, who was the leader of the Dublin Employers Group, his arch enemy. So he ran the Starry Plough flag up on the Imperial Hotel, and they ran the Irish Republic flag up on the GPO. So on the Easter Monday, not much happened because the British didn't know what was going on. They took control of all these buildings, and there was a squadron of Lancers on horseback in the north side of the city, and they were told to go down and investigate what was happening on O'Connell Street. And the volunteers fired on them, and I think they killed a few horses, and the Lancers retreated. And that's really all that happened on Easter Monday. By Easter Tuesday, the British had started to realise that they had a real event on their hands, and they started to move their weapons into position. They moved artillery opposite Liberty Hall and onto the green in Trinity College. And by Wednesday then, they started to bombard the city centre. They quickly decided they weren't going to fight on a hand-to-hand basis. By Thursday, most of the street was in flames. They had flattened all the lower part of O'Connell Street, and in particular, they decided that, I mean, their attitude was incredible. They decided the Metropole was in the way, so they simply destroyed the Metropole Hotel so they could fire them clearly at the GPO. By this stage, they destroyed Liberty Hall. The gunboat you were talking about, the Helga. The Helga came up and demolished Liberty Hall because they thought that was the headquarters. And then they realised that the actual headquarters were here. So there was sniping going on here for the Tuesday and Wednesday. By Thursday, this place was in flames. It was all artillery fire, and they were concentrating their fire on the GPO.
The Royal Hibernian Academy summer show went up.
Was destroyed.
Did it?
Flames.
Yes.
Royal Hibernian Academy was in there.
Oh, was it here?
It was in Abbey Street. It was further down, I think, wasn't it?
And who?
Yeah.
Because it was the Helga that got it.
Yes.
Was it?
Yeah, and because it was because it was the Helga, it was insured. It's
Yes.
the only time that every artist in that show was paid for their work.
Really?
Because it was destroyed.
Bring on the revolution.
Yeah.
That's what I say.
Maybe we could organise something for the Little Museum in Dublin.
We could. Yes, we could organise a gunboat in the Stephen's
Well, we
Green
should
and
have
the
a little
pond.
memorial to the Helga. The
Yeah.
Helga ended up it was the first ship in the Irish Navy.
Was it?
Yes.
That's ironic.
When the British withdrew the agreement, the Free State Agreement,
Yeah.
Ireland was not allowed to have a navy, but they were allowed fishery patrol vessels, and the British government donated the Helga, which is a real slap in the face,
Yes.
to the Irish government as a fishery patrol vessel.
Oh, well.
So the volunteers had moved all the ammunition into the basement of the GPO, and by Thursday the place was in flames. On Friday the roof went on fire, and they were afraid the roof was going to collapse and cause explosions in the basement. So it was decided on Friday night that they had to abandon the GPO. Now the rest of the city here was either demolished or in flames, and the British had established firing lines along O'Connell Street, Talbot Street and Henry Street, and at the far end on Parnell Street. So you couldn't literally move in the street, so you were trapped in the building. And the volunteers who were in the surrounding buildings had to retreat so they were all in the GPO at this stage. So,
Why did they choose the GPO as their headquarters? I mean, wouldn't the Bank of Ireland, as the former Houses of Parliament, have been more appropriate?
They all lived on this side of the city. This is where people lived.
Yeah, but it's a post office.
But it was, which was symbolic.
Well, where the workers lived, you know.
that's a good question. I don't know the answers to
Right,
that.
okay.
No, that's a very good question.
Yeah.
Why did they choose here? I suppose it was a large imperial building.
And this is the capital city,
Yeah.
capital street.
It was the main street, and you must remember Nelson was here at the time.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know whether that had any
It
bearing.
had been many years since that actually was in Parliament.
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah. And the volunteers would not have wanted to associate with the old, what they regarded as a colonial parliament.
Okay.
Friday, the building is in flames, and it's very appropriate. And the jig was up. They had to evacuate. So to go back to this little map, their initial plan was to link up the remains. This area was still intact. Boland's Mill that area was still intact, but there was no point trying to get to here because Trinity College was an armed camp. So their plan was to try and escape to this volunteer area here, which was behind the Four Courts area, which was still in volunteer hands. But they really didn't have a plan. The jig was up and the whole thing was collapsing around them. But their initial plan was to try and make it over to North King Street. So they decided to evacuate on Friday night. So by the Friday night, the British had established barricades at the far end of Talbot Street, at both ends of Connell Street, and down the far end, the junction of Henry Street and the street with the church on it. What's that street running? Anyway, they had barricaded the far end of Henry Street, so you couldn't literally move on any of these streets. They were all machine gun bases. So there was a door similar to this into the GPO just further down the wall there. And they decided to try and get across this lane here. So literally they had to run the gauntlet across here. Now before that happened, O'Rahilly, what was O'Rahilly's first name?
Michael, wasn't it? Or
He, I've forgotten the man's first name, I can't remember. Anyway, O'Rahilly decided that he was going to try and break through this army barricade here. So he led a group of about 12 volunteers out to attack the barricades, but they were mowed down before they could get down the street. Most of them were either wounded or killed, and he was mortally wounded and sheltered in the doorway here. So the people remaining inside knew that there was no escape through the barricades, so they decided to get out into Moore Street here. So we just go down the lane. Imagine the scene, the place is in flames, it's pitch black, and the British Army are firing on anything that moves, but most of them made it across to here. At this stage, I understand there's about 30 of them. And they came down this lane here. Connolly, 2 of them were on stretchers. They had the 2 Red Cross nurses with them, one of whom was O'Farrell. And they came down this lane here. You have to remember, all these houses had basements, or most of the Georgian houses here. And the occupants were sheltering in the basement from the artillery fire. There was a doorway here, and they smashed in the doorway here and got into this building here. You have to remember there were people cowering in all these, trying to hide those who hadn't already got out of the city.
Yeah.
So there were people absolutely you can imagine, terrified with what was going on around them. So they got in through this door. Again, there was a British Army barricade up at the end of this street. So they, with their rifle butts, they basically broke down the walls. With their rifle butts, they basically broke through the walls and they made it as far as here. And
Are these the actual buildings?
No,
that were
you see,
there?
the whole place was flattened. They were all demolished. I mean, what was left had to be reconstructed.
So what is the controversy about restoring
Well,
these buildings if they're not the original
Well,
ones?
I think these couple are actually.
Yeah, I think they are.
These weren't. These were demolished, but these were the original buildings that were here at the time.
That one, that one, that one.
You can actually see the different
And probably
brick.
not that one, oddly enough. I think it's those three.
I'm not sure, but it's this group of buildings.
Well, yes, 1876.
So
No, that just says established, so it doesn't
does.
mean it was built.
It doesn't.
So they got as far as here during the night, Friday night, Saturday morning, and they were now holed up here. I think there were about 20 to 30 of them left, including the two nurses. And they decided that was it. The plan to get to North King Street just didn't make sense. It was only going to cause more bloodshed. So Pearse and Connolly decided they were going to surrender. But they decided they would send out a woman with a flag, which I probably would have made sense. Because I think the British Army simply would have shot them on sight. So she came out. No, I'm not sure if she went to this barricade or to the barricade that was on Henry Street. But O'Farrell.
Britain Street.
This is Britain Street.
Well, that's
down
the way
here.
they went down,
Yes,
because that's
she
where
went
they
to this
met.
barricade.
Yeah.
Yes, she went down to this barricade on what was then Britain Street. It's now Parnell Street, and she parleyed and she came back and she got Pearse. Went down again, and then Pearse was told to go back and write a formal note of surrender, and that was it. They were then taken out and brought to various places around the city. Connolly most of them ended up in Dublin Castle. But they were executed under the terms of, it was a field marshal execution, and he was acting under the defence of the Realm Act because he found letters on Pearse and Connolly from the German High Command. And Casement came back on the U-boat. Oh yes, we never talked about the countermanding orders. I mean, the other
It would
disaster.
be more successful.
Yes.
Much more successful.
MacNeil, no, I don't quite understand the politics of this, but MacNeil went along with the planning for the uprising based on Casement coming back from Germany with troops, basically, either Irishmen or Germans, and arms. Now, Casement, the latest I've read is that Casement came back on the submarine. He landed on Bannistrand and he was caught by the policemen. But he was coming back to try and stop the rising.
That's right. I heard that too. I read that too.
I've read that recently because he wasn't able to raise any volunteers in Germany, and he realised as German High Command there was no way they could get troops to Ireland with the Royal Navy patrolling the seas. So Casement was coming back to try and stop them. When MacNeil heard on Casement was caught on Easter Thursday. He was captured on Easter Thursday. The Aud then was captured on the Easter Friday. So MacNeil then on the Saturday said, look, this is a disaster, we're going to cancel this thing. And he cancelled on the Saturday, but the IRB group, the core group, met on the Saturday and they said, no, we're going to go ahead. But they went ahead with, I think, 1,100 people. Most of the volunteers actually didn't show up because
I think it was about a third of what they
the MacNeil put an ad in all the papers saying that manoeuvres were cancelled for the weekend. And the reason the British establishment was caught off guard was because they were used to the Ulster volunteers and the Irish volunteers parading around cities. Belfast would be full of volunteers, and down here every Sunday the Irish volunteers would be out parading. So the police were used to it. So when they saw them parading up O'Connell Street, they thought it was just another parade. The thing was always doing. But once Casement came back and was captured, and MacNeil saw that the Aud never made it, it was captured by the Royal Navy. So he probably did the sensible thing. Anyway, the boys decided to go ahead. So it was just, the whole thing was extraordinary. What was extraordinary was they were prepared to do it.
Yeah. Do you think
Is
they
there
knew they
any-
were doomed?
Sorry?
Do you think that they knew they were doomed?
Well, yeah. A number of them would have gone along with Pearse in what was the thing? The civilization was vanishing. This notion that the Irish nation was vanishing, and you had to do something to stop the rot.
Blood sacrifice.
Yeah.